You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com. For those of you who don't know, you can go over and listen to the audio stream, which broadcasts out to all the different internet networks as well as terrestrial stations. And you can come and join us in the simulcast for a little looser, more interactive experience of this show, and go to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, and you can join the other Intrepids over in the chat room where you can talk about this show and many other things. I want to welcome you here to the show. Glad you made it out. We're going to continue on with our series here on early Christianity, on Christianity and paganism, and how they do or do not blend. And if they can be blended is the better question. And really underneath it all is the question, why do you believe what you say you believe? I think this is an important thing, especially nowadays. I'm sitting and I'm watching the impeachment process in our country. And of course I have a certain bias because I don't believe that the president did anything wrong. Nothing impeachable. But I do look at the other side of the equation, try to listen to their arguments, and have yet to be impressed that they have come up with anything overwhelming, anything factual, anything evidential, anything impeachable. And yet they keep pushing that process. I heard Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, talking this morning in an address where she, and along with a lot of the other Democrats, have now started invoking the founding fathers of our country, which is something they don't do. Something the left tends to do is downplay the founders because they were all evil men. You know, they all owned slaves. They all excluded women. They were all for landowners and things like that. So patooey on the founders. Oh, unless you need their words to back what you're doing. Then suddenly it's okay to invoke the founders. I listened to Nancy Pelosi this morning. The first few things she said in her opening was to bring up the Declaration of Independence. I think her first words were in 1776, and I knew exactly what she was going to go for. And so she brings up the Declaration of Independence and then tries to talk about how the founders wanted to ensure that any elected president of this nation, constitutionally, could not make himself a king or align himself with other kings of other nations. And so that is the basis of their argument, that President Trump in his phone call was acting above the law and elevating himself to a king status. And they keep mentioning that the president is not above the law, as what they tag on that. This is a far stretch that they're trying to make now, because what they're trying to do is convince the American public, who has really grown weary, as probably you have, of hearing the whole debate over the impeachment thing. They're like, can we move on? And so this is what, and then she ends her statements with saying, we have all the Democrats have been praying about this. And the first words to come out of my mouth automatically while I was drinking a coffee was bullshit. I would like to see, by show of hands, how many Democrats on that impeachment committee have been prayerfully and heartfelt trying to reach a great constitutional solution. No! They're trying to reach a solution that they can sell to the American public, and it's not working. So, there, I lapsed into something that was political. This is current events. This is what's going on in your world. If you're not paying attention to that stuff, you're not missing much. Yesterday they had 4 scholars, academic scholars on, talking about what they presumed and what they assumed and what they felt about President Trump. There was one person, I don't think it was Nunes, I think it was Gates, who said to them, he asked them all a question. He said, by show of hands of everybody that's here testifying today, how many of you have factual evidence in hand that you know of firsthand that would implicate the president on anything? He says, show me your hands. Nobody could raise their hand because nobody had any firsthand evidential knowledge. Everything was presumption and assumption. And this is how this whole process is gone. So, once again, the Democrats have nailed home that impeachment is a political process. It's not bipartisan, which Nancy Pelosi called for a couple of months back. Has to be overwhelming evidence. Has to be bipartisan. Has to be all these things, and none of those things have come to play. So if you're paying attention to this in your country, now I know we have a lot of people out there in other countries that don't follow what's going on with our president. This is not your country, and I get that, and it doesn't involve you, but you do take some interest. There's all this caterwaul about how Trump, too, has shut down all the other governments out there hate him. That's not true. He's got a lot of governments like China, like Russia, like Ukraine, other countries that are very mindful of what he does. Same with, and there are a lot of countries that rely on him. And when he walked out of meetings yesterday in London, it was because of his stand, which has not changed on those issues. That's all I'm going to go into on that. So Trump is not hated around the world. Trump is disliked because he's making one of the things that came with the French Prime Minister yesterday, bad-mouthing him, and the Canadian Prime Minister bad-mouthing him, was because Trump said this. What have the Democrats been saying all along about rich people in America? They need to pay their fair share. So they're big on that. Trump says to the NATO allies, you have to pay your fair share. America's done carrying your ass. You guys get off your duff and start paying your fair share. America's not going to pull all the weight anymore. And this is what he gets criticized for. So if there's anybody that hates him, it's people who don't want to have to pay their fair share out there. So there you go. That's my take on it. That's enough of politics for today. Impeachment, it'll probably go through. Most of us knew that. It will more than likely be dead on arrival in the Senate because it does not meet the standards of what should remove a president from office. And mind you, this impeachment is strictly partisan. People will say, well, there were a couple of Republicans that voted for it. Well, those are Republicans that decided to come out and switch party, and they joined the Democrats. You're finding a lot of Democrats now. It'll be interesting to see what that vote ends up as, because there's a lot of Democrats, their constituents do not like the impeachment process. So let's see what happens. There you go. That's my take on politics for today, and we will move on to less current events and more ancient events and how they affect us currently in our spirituality, in our religion, and all these things about how we conduct our lives. And we've been talking about, why do you believe what you say you believe? What is this whole thing with Christianity, with paganism, with Christo-paganism? And I've chosen those two faith issues because predominantly here in the United States, in Western culture, it's fairly Christianized, but there is a rise in paganism and a fall-off in Christianity. And then there's a lot of people from both that find they want to blend the two. So that's why I started this series, just as kind of a quick look into an overview of why this is so. And we're really getting down into some of the history of the early church, the early Christian church, and how Christianity today does not reflect what the early church believed about Jesus, about Christianity itself, for at least the first 200, going into the first 300 years after the life of Jesus, who I believe was a historical person. And we've been talking about this, how the Orthodox Church has taken the mythological of Christianity and turn it into the literal history of Christianity. When the early believers started believing that Jesus was like the other past God-men, and that he could be elevated as a prophet, used as a symbolic God-man, and then the Christians took that on and said, no, it's literal. He really is the Son of God. Now, I'll put this caveat in there. I don't know nothing. It's like I say, the more shit I know, the more I know I don't know shit. But I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to ask you something. What if everything we learn in Christianity today, what if the literal divinity of Jesus, what if that's all real? What if it is diabolical mimicry? Oh, we don't know for sure, do we? That's the big question. So we ask the questions by looking at history, looking at how Christianity began, look at how it grew, look at how his followers, the followers of Jesus, made Jesus into a divine being, literally, as opposed to, and they said it was literal as opposed to figurative. And so that's what we're digging into. Now, I want to look at that with all that we've looked at so far up to this point. I want to look at Christianity's shift to liberalism. See, I say shift, I get Schiff, Adam Schiff in my head, shifty Schiff, because I hear that so much. And instead of literalism, I say liberalism, because I got Schiff in my head. And back up. And now we're going to take a look at Christianity's shift to literalism. All right? The mystery schools that existed in the early days of Christianity were highly regarded, but they were also very exclusive. They required extended training and probationary periods that not everyone could commit to or master. Oh, and by the way, before I get too deep into this, I just noticed on my own camera monitor screen, I'm wearing my shirt for the Democrats today. I find your argument highly illogical. There you go. Just happened to notice that on the camera screen as I was talking. So now we can move on. All right? So the Christians quickly sensed that there was a need to be filled here. And so they began to look for ways to make their religion, they had turned their followership of Jesus into a religion. They made to make it more accessible and therefore more popular to the common folks. And the common folk who were very exposed to the mystery religions in the whole region, the whole Canaanite region, Egyptian region, all the way up into the Mesopotamian region, Asia Minor. And so they were trying to make it more popular with the people. A movement began to take form, and it began to drag the arcana of the mysteries out to common knowledge and to make the emblems and rites understandable for people. And so Christianity could become more accessible if it eliminated its own tiered system of training and made membership faster. Let's boost those numbers. And unfortunately, just as with the mystery schools, what took so long to teach were the hidden, the metaphoric meanings of the myths. And when the intensive training was dropped, so were the esoteric, metaphoric teachings. Remember I said that there was this thing a long time ago when we talked about these mysteries, talked about how there was the exoteric understanding, those things that the mystery schools allowed people to see, to draw them in and ask questions. And when those people had sincere questions, they said, once they gauged the sincerity of their questions, the sincerity of their desire to know things, they brought them into the inner circle, where they taught the more esoteric, the inner mysteries, the things that they didn't put on display out, the inner workings of what they believed. And so this is something that now they started to put in Christianity, take those inner mysteries and put them outside. They put them out on their sleeves so people could see them. And when the intensive training was dropped, that's when the esoteric metaphoric teachings started to become more popular. And what was left were the stories and their outer literal meanings. And at the same time, this is when the Gospels began to be composed in the mid to late 1st century after the death of Jesus. And so a school of literalism began to grow. School of literalism began to grow in Christianity. It taught that Jesus was an historical person and that the events set out in the Gospels were historical facts and literally true. And many of the church authorities who supported the literal approach were also those who supported the abandonment of tiered membership and the teaching and the symbolic, the esoteric meanings of the scriptures. Origen, remember him? He didn't care for the literalists. He says of them that they attack allegorical interpretation and want to teach that divine scripture is clear and has nothing deeper than the text shows. And so, and he bristled about that. He said, there's more deeper things than what the surface shows you. And as an example, Origen believes that the story of the resurrection is metaphor. It doesn't involve a resurrection of the flesh and bone, of the body, as the mythic literalists taught. Origen called the resurrection of the flesh crude. A crude doctrine, he said, despite the fact that it was becoming the resurrection as it is believed in the church, a literal event that took place. Now, question you have to ask, did it literally take place? Was there some sort of divine magical power that resurrected Jesus? Was he divine? This doesn't answer that question. All we're doing is looking back to the early church to see what they taught. It was not taught that this was a literal thing for at least the first 200 years. So even though the levels of training had been dropped and myth had begun to be treated as fact in order to attract the masses, there seems to be a sort of contempt that started going on for the masses expressed in the writings of the period. Take the letter of St. Jerome to St. Gregory, Nazianzen, I can't even pronounce this, Nazianzen, St. Gregory Nazianzen, where Jerome says, nothing, quote, nothing can impose better on a people than verbiage. The less they understand, the more they admire. Our fathers and doctors have often said not what they thought, but that to which circumstance and necessity forced them. So, then there was this passage by Synesius, Bishop of Alexandria in the 4th century. He said, quote, in all my capacity as a bishop of the church, I shall continue to disseminate the fables of our religion. But in my private capacity, I shall remain a philosopher to the end. End quote. And it's kind of how nice for him that he could stay with philosophy's deeper meanings while he taught fables to the masses as literal truth. You get that picture? I think the church still does that to this day. In the 2nd century, the pagan writer Celsus complained of Christians that, quote, while there are few moderate, reasonable, and intelligent people who are inclined to interpret its beliefs allegorically, yet it thrives in its purer form among the ignorant, end quote. So the changing the mystery aspect, the mystery school teachings, the philosophy, turning that inside out and making those allegorical stories literal stories that the church upheld and taught, what they admit to doing was appealing to the ignorant masses. And for the most part, maybe there was some fact to that, because most people were not learned and studied. Remember when we contrasted that with China, who at this time had a very literate population, a very academically well-rounded population of common people. That was different in the Far East than it was in the Middle East, where this is all happening. So Origen believed that the literal sense of Scripture should only be taught to people initially to attract them to study the Bible so they may eventually venture into a deeper and more metaphoric understanding of the Scriptures as they existed at that time. Remember, there was no New Testament. We're talking Old Testament Scriptures at that point. And yet, Origen also said, quote, "It's true that those who have no way of abandoning their livelihood in order to learn philosophy, we instruct to believe without examining the reasons for their belief." So this is really what also started in the Orthodox Church. Just trust your teachers, trust your bishops, trust the hierarchy in the church, because God has appointed us to teach you. So you don't have to take time to do that. So, we wonder if it's truly necessary for people to abandon their livelihoods in order to be instructed with sound reasons for belief. This is what Origen put forward. He said, "We suspect that it may be possible to use one's reason, examine one's belief, and remain employed." But Origen was apparently unable, from his historical perspective, to make the connection between his own attitude and the ultimate success of the mythic literal approach that he so disliked. So Origen tried valiantly to maintain his allegorical approach to Scripture in the face of encroaching literalism from the Orthodox Church, but he failed. And he was the last church father to argue against mythic literalism. And for his troubles, he was declared a heretic after his death. There you go. Thanks. Thanks for serving us your whole life. See ya. So, the problem with telling people to believe without examining the reasons for what they believe is that eventually the reasons for their belief are forgotten. The reasons they believe are forgotten. What are most Christians like today? Christianized people. They've forgotten what they believe. And so the tiered structure of Christian teaching, the membership was abandoned, no hidden or esoteric truths concerning the Scriptures were taught, and the mythos was presented as historical fact. And this is the shift that we saw from teaching the mysteries, the allegorical, to elevating the allegorical to the literal so they could attract the common person. This is why we also saw, as the centuries passed, as they went on, the adapting of pagan ways back into orthodoxy, yet renaming them and restructuring them and redoing them so they could appeal to the masses who didn't believe in Christianity and pull them in. Look, we're just like you guys are. So they wore that stuff out on their sleeves to attract membership, which, as we all know, attracting membership is also synonymous with attracting money and support and giving those in leadership power and control. Now I'm going to control you with this show for a minute. We got to go out for 2 minutes, so you sit tight. We'll be right back. Hang on. Hey gang, welcome back. This is the second segment of tonight's show. I'm Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And it's a different spelling for Odyssey. If you look at the little logo, if you're over here, I got to do this in mirror reflection. It's that way. There it is, right there. I'm trying to look at the camera, which comes up backwards on my screen. There. You see it right there. Boom. Odyssey. ODYSY1.com. If you were just listening on the radio, you're already here. So you didn't get to see that little bumbling around with my camera. Also join the chat room, the live interactive chat room, and the video simulcast of this radio show over on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we were just talking about this shift to literalism in the early church. And we can see everything we've talked to up to this point, how the church adapted that. Because the early church did not believe some of these things literally and did not teach them. Now, you may have had your pockets of believers who did, but that this is also the period where the Gospels were written in the early, the mid to late 1st century. Then during the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, there were a hell of a lot of edits by church fathers who needed those scriptures to say what they needed them to say. Getting back that far in the original text is the tough part, because we don't always go right back to the 1st century where some of these things were written. So let's move on. Let's go from the literalism to the accusations and the responses that came in the early church. Once this changed to mythic literalism, that is, taking the mythical allegorical stories about Jesus and the Christ and moving those into literalism. This is our literal history now. Once that was complete, what had once been seen as a symbolic mythos was treated as literal fact, and any knowledge of the teachings being otherwise was rapidly lost and disappeared. And the 19th century writer, Egyptologist Gerald Massey, asks us to imagine just how perplexed the Christians of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD must have been, who had started from the new beginning altogether, which they'd been taught to consider solely historic, when they turned back to look for the first time to find that an apparition of their faith was following them one way and confronting them the other. So all the things that were the early church were being confounded and confused by the new literalism that was in place, and this apparition was the pagan and the symbolic origin of their beliefs and their practices. And Tom Harper, who's a professor of Greek and New Testament, says this. He says, then the charge of pagan enemies and critics of Christianity was sounded. You have stolen all our beliefs and rights, they claimed, and by making them out to be concrete, historic events, you have claimed them as your own. This was the criticism coming from the pagan ideology. And so the pagan Celsus, for example, writes in the 2nd century that the Christians, quote, are really very dishonest, borrowing even their incantations from other religions in their magic acts, end quote, meaning their rituals in the Orthodox Church were things. He's calling them thieves. You've borrowed, you're dishonest, you've taken this stuff from other beliefs and other practices. And in discussing the Christian view of the Christian view of heaven, he states that the fact that their system is based on very old teachings may be seen from similar beliefs in the old Persian mysteries associated with the cult of Mithras. Celsus also said, it's clear to me that the writings of the Christians are a lie, and that your fables have not been well enough constructed to conceal this monstrous fiction. So he's saying, look, the stuff you're saying, the stuff you're writing, the stuff your church fathers are writing, the practices in your church aren't even constructed well enough to conceal the fact that you've stolen all this from the mystery schools and pagan religion and twisted it and adapted it to make your own. No one bothered to respond to Celsus when he made that charge for 70 years, long after he'd died. It was then that Origen wrote a lengthy response to Celsus called Contra Celsum. Of course, this was posthumous because Celsus was already dead. So Origen is writing this to him, in which he sets out about 70% of Celsus's text as he responds to it. This is a fortunate thing that he did this, since Origen's quotes, quoting Celsus, are all that's left of Celsus's work, and all the rest were burned and destroyed by Christians. So beginning in the 3rd and the 4th centuries, and continuing for some time, the Christians destroyed all the pagan writings they could find. Bishops ordered books to be burned. And now remember, books back then weren't like books now. I'm going to state the obvious. You had a copy of a book back then. It wasn't a hardbound like the books we have now. They were usually on scrolls, or they were on parchments that were laced into leather covers and things like that. We didn't have bookstores where you could just go, I lost my copy of the works of Celsus, so I'll just go down to the local bookstore and buy a new one. Didn't happen that way, and books were very expensive because they were all handmade. So when they destroyed these libraries and these books, just like when the Christians destroyed in the 300s the Library of Alexandria, they restored irreplaceable documents. It would be amazing, don't you think? It'd be amazing to know what different cultures had stored in the Library of Alexandria. Well, this is what happened with early church. Beginning in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and continuing for some time, the Christians destroyed all the pagan writings they could find. All the bishops were ordering the pagan books to be burned. And eventually so did the Roman, now Christian, emperors. That time, the Roman emperors became Christian emperors. And anything that was found about mystery paganism, the mystery religions, the mystery schools, was destroyed. As were pagan commentaries, critiques of Christianity, the works of the Gnostics, the philosophers Plato, and the writings of the Essenes. Entire libraries were burned to the ground, and as we already mentioned, including the incomparable and the irreplaceable Library of Alexandria in Egypt. And so when the Christians came to the Egyptian monuments, they sometimes hacked away at the figures and at other times covered them with plaster. I was in Karnak Temple Complex in Luxor, and this is where it's not one temple; it's many dozens of temples erected by different pharaohs. And there is one temple in there, the Temple of Amenhotep II, which I visited. It's almost like a porch of pillars, and it sits at the far end of Tutmos III's big sacred pool, which is there. And I'm over there on Amenhotep's, on the porch of this, and down at the far end, you could see a crucifix, all in ancient stone. This big crucifix and a figure on it. Well, you walk closer to that, and you find out that this was all old statuary and old monuments broken apart and rebuilt into the wall to form a crucifix. It was not originally a crucifix. It was something entirely different. And that was one of the first times I saw that firsthand. And maybe if I think of it tomorrow, I can get a picture of it and I can show you what that looks like. But this is an example of the early Coptic church in Egypt that did away with the old, what they thought were the old gods, and they appropriated the temples and they made them Christian. They plastered over everything and put their own imagery and their own paintings. I was also at Menedot Habu, I believe it was, which is in a temple in Luxor. And they were restoring some of the paintings. And you got to look at it this way. Some of the paintings fell off. The Christians had plastered the whole thing white, then painted all their own imagery over the top. Think of how Byzantine paintings looked of the early church, and you get the idea. The problem with, you can't take that down and destroy it to reveal what was older under there, because even now, the Christians plastering and repainting, that stuff is 1,700 years old. That is antiquity and historically valuable, just as it is. So they're trying to restore all the parts that were revealed underneath, and the parts that still contain the plaster and the paint of the early church. So they plastered over everything. And when the Christians came to the Egyptian monuments, they tore them apart, and they restructured them. Eventually, the need to do this faded out, and as no one knew how to read the hieroglyphs anymore. And so it wasn't until the Rosetta Stone was discovered at the mouth of the Nile River by Colonel Broussard of Napoleon's army. Napoleon, by the way, huge Egyptologist. He conducted many, many, many campaigns of archaeology in Egypt. It was discovered by Colonel Broussard, the Rosetta Stone, that the world of the Egyptian religion was opened up again in the 19th century. So Kuhn offers a dramatic rendition on the effect of finding the Rosetta Stone. When he wrote this, Kuhn said this: "The pick that struck the Rosetta Stone in the loamy soil of the Nile Delta in 1796 also struck a mighty blow at historical Christianity. For it released the voice of a long, voiceless past to refute nearly every one of Christianity's historical claims with a withering negative. The cryptic literature of old Egypt, sealed in silence when Christianity took its rise, but haunting it like a taunting specter after the 3rd century, now stalks forth like a living ghost out of the tomb to point its long finger of accusation at a faith that has too long thriven on falsity." That's what he wrote in the late 1700s about the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. As Harpur says, "It may never be known to a certainty if Christianity plagiarized from the pagans. But, judging by the utter ferocity of the reaction of the Church of the 3rd and 4th centuries, we can conclude that this accusation was regarded by the Church authorities as a highly embarrassing and even lethal rebuke to what they were teaching in the Orthodox Church. All the signs point to a guilty, fearful conscience at work." How did church officials respond in their writings to these accusations? At first, they ignored them. They brushed them off. We're the church fathers. We got it licked here. But these accusations that they were falsifying, that they were creating, twisting old religion and adapting all of those symbolisms, all those magics, all those writings to their own literal historical point of view, they had to respond. At first they ignored them, but then they attempted to demonstrate that paganism and Christianity were essentially identical, so that Christianity would not seem strange or threatening. Of course, such statements of identity can be seen as admissions that the pagans were correct in their accusations. Remember, so we can do this again. You could use this shirt. "I find your argument highly illogical," they were saying to the Christians. Remember Tertullian's response to the pagans, that he said, "You say we worship the sun, S-U-N, so do you." And so this is such a statement of identity. As another example, St. Justin Martyr, the guy who called all the pre-God men diabolical mimicry of Satan. Justin Martyr explains to the pagans that in saying the Word was born for us without sexual union, as Jesus Christ our teacher, we introduce nothing beyond what is said of those called the sons of Zeus. It's because Zeus did the same thing, it said. So he's referring here, of course, to the stories of other virgin births in these previous god men to Jesus, celebrated in Greek mythology religions. And in a letter to Servianus, the Emperor Hadrian wrote this: "Those who worship Serapists are like Christians. Even those who style themselves the bishop of Christianity are devoted as Serapists. So thereby he was professing that the worship of Serapis, also virgin-born, also killed, also resurrected, to be essentially the same as the worship of Jesus. It's because Christianity had stolen these items so obviously and and unabashedly that you couldn't even tell the difference. Later, St. Augustine wrote, "That which is known as the Christian religion existed among the ancients, and never did not exist, from the very beginning of the human race until the time when Christ came in the flesh, at which time the true religion, which already existed, began to be called Christianity." It's almost like taking what already exists and just renaming it Christianity and worshiping Jesus as opposed to some other God-man. So apparently before it began to be called Christianity, it was known by other names like paganism. So as the literal position of the church hardened and the church gained temporal power after Constantine, this approach to answering the pagans was really heard no more. And then instead, the church realized that what had really happened was that the devil, Satan, had gone back in time, planted all of Christianity's themes, characters, stories, and rites into the pagan mystery religions ahead of time to confound the common folk and to dissuade them from believing in the real God, the real God-man, Jesus. This was that diabolical mimicry. Justin Martyr explains it best in his own words. Listen to this. This is what Justin Martyr said. When they tell that Bacchus, son of Jupiter, was begotten by Jupiter's intercourse with the woman Semele, and when they relate that being torn to pieces and having died, he rose again and ascended to heaven, and when they introduce wine into his mysteries, do I not perceive that he, the devil, has imitated the prophecy announced by the patriarch Jacob and recorded by Moses? And when he, the devil, brings forward this name I have, the Aescul, Asclepius, I can't pronounce that right. I'll get it. Asclepius, maybe, as the raiser of the dead and the healer of all diseases, may I not say in this matter, continues Justin Martyr, likewise that he has imitated the prophecies about Christ? And when I hear that Perseus was begotten of a virgin, I understand that the deceiving serpent, the devil, counterfeited this also. End quote. That was Justin Martyr. Once the church articulated this position, it was used frequently. They got their argument and they used it. The resemblances between the feasts in honor of Jesus and Attis's resurrections were so striking, for example, that it led to conflict in the 4th century with the followers of Attis, claiming that the resurrection of Jesus was a spurious imitation of Attis's resurrection, and while the followers of Jesus claimed that Attis's resurrection was a diabolical counterfeit of Jesus' resurrection. And in a similar vein, Tertullian observes that the cult of Mithras, which practiced baptism, offered forgiveness of sins, celebrated a communion of bread, and promised a resurrection, is obviously the work of the devil, who implanted such things in the mystery religions before Christianity came along. That's what Tertullian said. A related argument that we've heard, which might be called the fulfillment argument, goes something like this. Whatever truth the pagans had was only partial, whereas Christianity represents God's full and perfect revelation to mankind, which replaces all the partial and imperfect ones that came before. Christianity, therefore, is a fulfillment of what the pagan religions only pointed to imperfectly. So this argument expresses an opinion that Christianity is better, more complete, more perfect than all the other religions that came before it. And this is certainly an opinion a person can hold. You can believe that. And maybe you can justify the belief of that in your own heart and in your own spirituality. But you may hold it personally, but it's not an answer to the charge of whether or not Christianity borrowed or plagiarized all those things from paganism. So, you got to take the church's arguments completely out of a religious context in order to see them from a different perspective. To remove them from a venue that might be highly emotional, you got to look at how the arguments sound in a different context. So, such as education. Imagine a teacher saying to her student, Johnny, Susie, I'm very concerned because the paper you handed in greatly resembles Johnny greatly resembles Susie's paper from the last semester. I can see you changed some bits here and there, but the majority of it is just like Susie's. Johnny says, Teacher, the serpent of evil went back in time to last semester and implanted my thoughts in my paper, my essay that I wrote, went back in time to last semester and implanted my paper into Susie's mind in order to create this problem for me today. Now, if you were the teacher or Johnny's parent, what would you say to his answer? What do you think is the reason Johnny's paper is so much like Susie's? The teacher replies, Johnny, that's just not an adequate answer, and I'll not accept it. So he says, but teacher, Susie's paper is imperfect. The one I turned in is a full treatment of the subject. In fact, it should be the standard by which all other papers on this subject are judged. And it's obvious that Susie's paper falls short, while mine completes what she was trying to do with hers. So if you were his teacher or his parents, how would you respond to this answer? Has Johnny satisfactorily explained why his and Susie's papers are so resemble each other in content? Probably not. Now, an imperfect example because it's illustrating an issue of singularity. A singular term paper is not a whole religion. Dealing with world religions. I get that. And I'm dry. Got to take a sip of coffee. Which is now cold. But that's okay. We've only got a couple of minutes left of this program. 3 minutes and we're done. I hate to say it. So, because I could keep going. But, so you're talking religion, the universal church, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church stole so much material from the pagans that this is in essence what they were doing. And Justin Martyr, a church apologist, was the one that stood up and said, well, you know what? The devil knew prophecy too. And he just rose up these other religions to confound what the actual coming of the real Son of God, the real God-man would be. And he also went back in time and implanted into their hearts and minds Christianity so they could distort it. And he only did this in part, though. So there's something to keep in mind within Christian theology, that the devil or Satan is not an equal to, in Christian theology, even Old Testament theology, Jewish theology, Satan is not an equal to God. God is the one who is the most powerful. He didn't create an equal yin and yang. Evil and good might be yin and yang, but God did not, Satan was not on an equal level with God. Satan was a created being, according to theology in Judeo-Christianity. So God at any time could have stopped Satan from doing anything he's doing, if this is indeed what Satan, the devil, did, was go back in time and change things. If Satan did that, God should have been able to stop him from doing that. Don't you think? And I've asked this question before. If all of this stuff is counterfeit, leading up to this, to the time of Jesus, and Jesus was the one true, why is it that God didn't just go, okay, that's all counterfeit, I'm going to do this a little differently this time, or I'm going to reveal it that it's differently? God didn't do that. And so we're left to the first few centuries after the death of Jesus to start to figure this all out. And then the church came along and destroyed everything else before it. So nobody would be able to see it. Until the last couple of centuries, where we've started to see some of this stuff rise up and out. We found these things mixed into the writings, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We find some of the apocryphal books, some of the Gnostic books, some of the Essene works, all mixed in with New Testament scriptures, Old Testament scriptures. So this is what you got going on. And I got to end with that tonight. We're going to get tomorrow into Jesus and historians. But for now, tonight we're done. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. I hope that this is as intriguing to you as it is to me. So we're going to go out for a 23-hour break. We'll see you there tomorrow night. So sit tight.